No home runs in this pod. We're working station to station. I am back with my co-host and battery mate Dustin as always, and our guest today is Aamir. We are going to discuss some sober second thoughts on the Jays playoffs, particularly game number 2, and of course all of the controversy and discussion that has followed. Of course, Ross Atkins has had his season-ending press conference as well, so we've kind of got all of the info to talk about. Dustin, uh, have you had any change of heart or any change in how you felt about how things were handled last week?
Well, I think over the Thanksgiving weekend, I've gone through my stages of grief. I've achieved acceptance, and I'm just ready to see what we got going on the off season.
I did have a chance to, and I'm gonna kind of quote a source here. It's not a primary source, but a secondary source. I at the Letters podcast is anything I mention is I'm going to be pulling from there. Those guys do a good job of having very calm, I think, serious conversation about things, and I think they both provided both Nicholson Smith and Arden Dwelling kind of provided a couple different perspectives on it. Ben actually in the moment liked it because he had wrote earlier in the day how this was going to be a possibility just based on Berrios' track record against lefties and just how he thought the game was going to play. And in the moment he liked it, and then after the fact he actually switched his mind. And conversely, Ardenswellig didn't like it, and then after the fact, basically dug up a bunch of stats to support why he uh, thought it was a decent move.
Yeah, I mean, he had some compelling arguments there. Um, I mean, mostly that the numbers say that Kikuchi probably was a better bet due to the numbers of Barrios after. I think he looked at like after the fourth inning, but he was trying to find the third time through, and there's no real stats for that. But Barrios's numbers after the fourth inning were not great, and you're trying to win this game. Uh, and there is an argument to be said also. I don't know if he made this one, but something I thought about. I mean, you look at what happened. Results are that, yeah, 2 runs were scored, but you know, Kikuchi got what, 4 ground balls there.
Yeah, he
Um,
did mention that.
yeah, so I mean that is kind of the result you're looking for: ground balls to the infield. Unfortunately, some of them got through and runs were scored.
Aamir, why don't you tell me about kind of in the moment on that, I guess Wednesday night or Wednesday, I guess late afternoon, how you felt uh, when Barrios got the hook.
I mean, I was a little bit surprised, I guess you could say, but I understood where it was coming from because a few friends had been discussing kind of game one and what happened in game one, and I had this crazy theory of, well, Kikuchi's the only lefty, why not start him first, right? Game one, and then kind of save your best guy for a possible game three was kind of what I was working with. So I wasn't totally surprised when I saw it. I was pretty alarmed when I saw it though, um, because the reality is Barrios could have let those 2 runs come in. Something could have happened, but Kikuchi let them in. It doesn't really. That's none of it's really here nor there to me in that context. What really is important, one thing we haven't talked about is the offense, right? 2 runs, right? Game two, we had 0 runs. The Jays had
Mm-hmm.
0 runs. So to me, that was the more relevant piece there when it came to pitching. And Dustin brought up a really interesting point there about ground balls because I heard Ross Atkins during his press conference talking about how they stick by the plan basically that they had, and a lot of good contact was made, or there's good contact stats, and that type of thing. And like some of these stats in baseball, they really, I find them very, very like not confusing, but confounding. Um, so in one context, contact is good. In another context, contact is bad. but what are you measuring your stats against? Like ground ball contact given what kind of factors related to the defense you're hitting into. Like that's my whole thing with all these stats and like all these different areas of confound that there's it's really puzzling to me how certain stats get valued versus others that don't get valued or considered adequate. That's for me the missing piece with all this stuff. But as far as Wednesday night goes, to answer your original question, a little bit concerned, obviously, but not surprised.
Well, so I think the answer you're referring to. So Ross Atkins, and we can talk about his press conference in a little bit, but I think he was basically asking like, you know, why did this team fail essentially? And I think he basically said like he responded thinking that basically saying that he didn't in his plan he didn't think it would fail. He thought that you know, in terms of good contact numbers, and that is a very general term. Whether he's talking about you know barrels or exit velocity, and there's like sub stats that go into those stats, which I agree they're quite confusing. Um, but I think with this Berrios situation, like the play essentially was, and I still disagree with it, but the play is that Barrios he has traditionally been hit hard by lefties. So by the third time through the order now, that's pretty common with most pitchers. But basically he gets hit by lefties, and I'm just looking here the stats that they were talking about in the particular podcast I referenced, Barrios versus lefties during the season, and I think he has basically that he had the second most innings, I guess. Like so, in terms of the sample size, it's quite large, and so the
Mhm.
OPS 774 and 16 home runs given up versus lefty. So pretty sizable. Now Kikuchi on the other hand versus righties, 756 OPS and 21 home runs. Now
Why?
the
Well, sorry to interrupt. Why is
no
that
worries.
stat more relevant than the record or the stats versus the specific team that's being faced?
Well, no, and I think this is I think you're bringing up a very good point. Like I don't think it's necessarily I don't think it necessarily is
It's
more
not.
important.
Yeah.
I think it's not, right? And I think this is the problem, kind of with this whole situation is that, there is a group of people in this organization that are basically just using numbers, and decisions are being made based off of that. Now,
Well,
the other play, and let me just I'll let you jump in a moment, Dustin. The other play that they're trying to do is that the Twins basically the Twins have better lefties than righties, and so the other play in this is to basically ferret them out. So you get rid of these lefties in hopes that later in the game you're facing, you have two at bats versus a right-handed batter because the Twins will pinch hit. This is what they do, and so you're basically having at bats against worse players essentially. That's the other play that was at hand
Mm.
yeah, and I think back when these stats started coming into vogue, like I would say maybe the mid to late 2000s ish, there was a lot of talk about these numbers as helping the money ball stuff and Billy Bean and all that good stuff, and how it was something that the people at the time didn't catch. But I think, and it was like an opportunity for them to like, you know, uh, gain an advantage that other teams didn't have. And I think like now there's almost that like the opposite problem. And like back then we used to talk about like um, the intangibles as something that people were missing when you talked about these stats. And I talked about it on the last episode, like Barrios is just shoving. There's something to be said with the intangibles, not just the stats, but like how does it make you know your team feel when you've got a guy that's just performing and you're going to pull him out. There was a shot of Boba, talking to Vladdy, and that they're like, what the fuck is going on? And then on the other side of the diamond, in the other dugout, the twins are like, um, you know, they're pulling him out. Yes, this is our chance. This is our opportunity. Whatever the numbers say about, the stats or whatever. I mean, I'm a stats guy. I believe in that stuff, but I mean, there's something to be said for that intangible that I think was missed in that moment, and they need to be better at. I think that if I'm going to criticize anybody, it's John Schneider. In that moment, needs to be better at recognizing that's a moment for just to leave Berrios in, let him finish that inning. You want to bring in Kikuchi in the next inning, so be it. That's great. Give him a clean inning. That's what Kikuchi's used to. You know, I think that would have gone over much better in that moment.
Well, Dustin, just to jump in before Aamir gets in here. So I did look through the game summary, and this whole scenario, like the reason they did it in the fourth was because these, 3 out of 4 lefty batters coming up, plus Carlos Correa. The next time this would have been, um, basically the next opportunity to do this would have been in the 6th inning. So if you were to pull Berrios out in the 5th, I think you'd probably bring in like a righty maybe. But
Yeah.
the next opportunity to do that would have been in the 6th inning.
I don't know. I think we've talked about a lot about the reasons. I think it wasn't a bad move in general, like in a vacuum. Yeah, my biggest sort of problem with it is just the the ignorance or the dismissal of those intangibles of what the moment meant and what you know I mean, you felt it, I felt it when we were watching it. Like, what are they doing? Why are they taking him out?
Well, it was
Like,
pre-planned, right? So it was pre-planned, and they were
of
following this
course.
plan. And I think our issue is that the influx of, if you want to do
Yeah, you got
this,
to be able to switch
okay,
it up.
but you got to be able to say, hey, as you said, this guy's shoving.
It's the only thing they seem to have not considered. What if Barrios is really being out there? Like, do we stick to the
Mm-hmm.
plan, right? Maybe they did. I don't know. But obviously, it was a bad call. I just wanted to kind of look at some basic stats here because it seems like we get really, really into the weeds about innings, etc., and all this type of stuff. I looked up OPS for 3 of the Jays pitchers: Kikuchi, Barrios, and Gosman. And Kikuchi and Barrios have similar at bat numbers that they've faced. So 73, it's identical actually. 73 for Barrios and 73 for Kikuchi as well. I just want to make sure. And against the Twins, I'm talking about. And Kikuchi's OPS, I guess against, is 865. And Barrios is 529.
Oof.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. So
and
so we're talking about, like, there's all these stats nerds, right? We're talking about these stats nerds, and this is seemingly a very obvious stat that Aamir just laid right at our feet that we haven't even talked about yet. That seems like you probably should have looked at this one.
The,
yeah,
the reality. Go ahead, Dustin. Sorry.
well, I'm just going to say, that sounds like uh, amazing, but like we don't know what stats they're looking at too. That's the problem. Is like they're not as transparent with all that as I mean. I guess they don't want to be because then you're giving the info to the other team. But like, are they looking at more than just OPS? And should they be? I don't know. Maybe that's just a number to
Well,
look at.
I think just coming from a bit of a background where I look at data a little bit for a living, and I look at actually more individualized data as opposed to big data sets. One of the ways in which kind of you want to consider a player's data potentially, I would think, because they're an individual person, is based on adding context. And when you have a bigger yes, if you're on base plus you're slugging, that gives you more of a contextual big picture snapshot as opposed to a super, super reductionist little mini stat about how a pitcher's fourth inning goes, for example. And when you have a
Yeah.
very kind of more broad stat, um, that stat, theoretically may incorporate some of those what Dustin was referring to earlier as almost intangibles into it. Now, I'm not saying that the OPS incorporates a measurement of how glum Bobichette looks given a particular circumstance. But what I'm saying is that you have to look at, I think, the more relevant, tried, tested, and true stats that held up over time. There's a reason why OPS is always, always, always featured prominently when they're showing a player's stats on the screen, I think. So, yeah, I think there's obvious stuff out there, and some of that feel stuff can be added to those obvious stats, and that's the way to do it when you're looking at an individual person's behavior anyway, and what you think you're going to get out of them.
Yeah, and to be fair to the Blue Jays, that the fourth inning stat was something that was brought up by a commentator on a podcast. It's
I
not
see. I
necessarily what
see.
the Jays are looking at, right?
My apologies, Blue
Yeah,
Jays.
and
So
the now the other thing that I was thinking of is like the Blue Jays made a big deal out of Jose Berrios, our second, is going to be our second game starter. Like, no talk about Bassett. Chris Bassett had a great finish to the year, 200 innings, all kinds of other stats that really showed what a great pickup he was. So you go to this big deal of basically naming Berrios your game two starter, and then you hook him. You hook him like super early. It just like I don't know I'd like to know how Chris Bassett does he have issues with lefties after the fourth inning? Like if he doesn't, why didn't he start?
There's a lot that goes into that choice. I don't think. I mean, to me, they just kind of kept the rotation rolling. They probably just sold it as, listen, this is the order you guys are in. We're going to keep it that way. You know, Bassett, we want you for that important third game. If we win, if we're in the third game, that's a must win. So we want you there. You're a guy for that must win game. I mean, there's a way. I mean, that's the job of the staff, is to sell it to the guys and to make sure that they feel like they're important or whatever the case may be. Um, yeah, I don't know if that's as big of a deal as, really the in-game kind of move.
Well, I take that point at face value. The moving into I guess the weekend. So we have post game press conferences. John Schneider's essentially talking about how this. He was kind of basically telling us how this is the plan and not really taking too much responsibility for it, but it seemed like this is a part of a grand plan they had for game number two. And then Ross Atkins has his year end or season end press conference on a holiday weekend, I might add, and basically takes no responsibility. And, I think I do have a question for you guys about this, but I just want you to talk a little bit about this press conference and what you thought about uh, Atkins and kind of how you see this team going forward.
I mean, he drove the bus right over Schneider. I I don't know, man. He drove it over him and then drove it back, backwards again. I don't. That's all that I was thinking when I saw that. I mean, I guess I didn't expect him to come out and say it was my decision and just like throw himself to the wolves. But I didn't expect him to just kind of totally absolve himself of any blame and and lay it all at the feet of Schneider.
Dustin's going to be super diplomatic. It is kind of like his show. I guess I will not be. So what I heard from this guy on that during that press conference on that, I guess uh, Friday before the holiday long weekend was someone that was trying to basically twist himself into all kinds of different shapes to not say that he had any role in the decision making process. A lot of really, really Weasley language, like, well, we have a staff
Mm-hmm.
generates stats, and John gets to pick which stats he wants to see, et cetera, et cetera. But what I got from that press conference was there's a culture that exists where there's a process in place, and the manager is expected to follow that process. So even though Atkins wouldn't have directly given the order, et cetera, I'm pretty certain based off of what I heard that it's understood that Schneider is going to follow what the analytics guys say. That's the culture of the team. Like these out of control baseball nerds running around, almost not necessarily giving the order, but making very, very strong suggestions. What's interesting to me too is that things are going to kind of stay the same probably next year. I don't know, Dustin and Alex, what you make of what Atkins was saying. There was all this talk about reflecting and kind of making changes, etc. I don't know that anything changes next year based on the approach. I think they're really, really stuck in their numbers.
Um, it can go one of two ways. I think we're going to find out on Thursday where that path is going to lead, because Shapiro's got his presser on Thursday, and if they're going to fire Atkins, for example, that's the moment that they would do that. Um,
Mm.
so basically, that's going to tell the tape to me. If Shapiro comes out and he's, we're bringing back Atkins, everything's good, status quo, blah blah blah. I mean, look, I have no problem with the way that this front office has built the team necessarily. When we started this year, everybody was the Blue Jays were the sexy World Series pick for a lot of people, not just Blue Jays fans. So I think they built a good team that just underperformed. I wouldn't have a problem with them giving them the keys for one more year and see what they can do to fill the holes. Uh, you're saying if that's status quo, yeah, but I mean, status quo wasn't that bad. We got to the playoffs. They just need to be better at building that, offense. I can definitely see a lot of the coaching staff um, leaving. I mean, we've got, I think, the third base coach, Luis Rivera, retired
Retired.
this year. So there's a spot there. I can't see them bringing back Guillermo Martinez as the hitting coach. Like this,
Oh, I
the
hope
offense.
not.
Yeah,
Holy,
like
come on, come
so
on.
if there's one sacrificial lamb, it'll be him for sure. And I hear that the coach, the hitting coach in the AAA team is pretty good. And judging by what the Buffalo Boys have done when they've come up and shown some flashes of awesomeness, maybe he is the answer they need on that front. We'll see.
It's like Davis
So,
Schneider. Like it's just one thing real quick. It's like Dustin brings up the Buffalo Bisons. Like Davis Schneider comes up and it's like he's smashing the ball all over the play the first little bit. And then it's almost like the shitty like Jay's hitting coach got to him or something. And
well, yeah, I don't think it was that. I think they just realized that he can't hit a high fastball or a fastball away, or basically any ball out over the plate, and he basically lives low and inside, and
Yeah.
swings
they
with
just
everything
pitch,
as.
and those are big holes. But I think that's always what I think. As soon as any Buffalo Bison comes up and does well, they're like, oh, he's gonna be ruined, right? Because that's just Anyway, now I do want to ask a question about specifically
Well,
that press conference. Oh,
Al,
hold on.
before you do that, I did want to get what do you think about Amir's question there about what are we going to do?
Well,
What's going to happen here?
I so I think that's a complex question, and I do think some of it will be answered on Thursday. When and I do think Ross Atkins. I don't think he's going anywhere. Him and Shapiro are buddies, so really, I think Shapiro's going to have to be pushed to really make a decision on that. Um, Atkins did talk about, how they were going to improve the team internally, but also externally. He also basically said that they weren't going to re-sign any of the free agents. I don't know if you noticed
Yeah.
that. He basically
He
said, "Oh,
back
these guys
he
aren't coming back," and then he backtracked
he backtracked
afterwards.
on that. Yeah,
So
I can see
they're
Kiermaier
not
coming
primary.
back maybe.
So I don't think they're primary options. I think that's what that is.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and I was listening to I was listening to, I guess, a podcast, the JD Bunkus podcast. I think he's on from like 9 to 11 on the Fan, and
Yeah.
he had Ben Nicholson Smith on, and they're talking about like possible free agents. Like, I'm sorry, but if he thinks that these kind of scrap heap players, this is the Atkins and Shapiro way from like a few years ago. It's like they take a scrap heap player that like and they try to make it work. I am saving. I have a couple players in mind that I'd like them to go all in on and sign. And I'm not going to say that they're going to fix everything, but I think they'll. I think they would go a long way to basically rectifying the issue with the hitting. And frankly, that's what needs to happen, because if they don't actually have a big offseason like they did last year, and things start to go tits up in the first, let's say in April or May, the fans are not going to be happy. Like, so if Ross Atkins isn't the sacrificial lamb on Thursday, and they have a meager offseason, and they get off to maybe a bad start, or they have a rough go of it, like May, like last year, the fans are not going to be happy at all.
Yeah, I'm not going to be happy, and I'm probably one of the easiest to please. So, I mean, uh, yeah, I mean, I agree. I think they have to have a big off season. I mean, everybody has to have a big off season. We talked about Vladdy has to have an off season. I mean, Bobichette, I mean, he's probably okay. But, Manoa has to have an off season if he's going to try and come back. I mean, this whole team, Varsho, I mean, if Kiermaier's not coming back, he's going to be the center fielder. He's going to be the guy. So he's got to kind of,
Mm-hmm.
um, have a breakout year. There's a lot we're riding on. And I think, in terms of free agents, we can kind of have maybe a whole podcast on that, and we can talk about it. I bet you I'm thinking of some of the same guys you are. But yeah, there's a lot of holes to fill. Belt's not going to come back. I think he's probably already, camping or hunting or fishing or whatever he
Yeah,
does.
he's considering retirement.
Yeah, I'm sure he's going to retire. Chapman is, at the top of a really weak third base class, and they've got some reasonable options there. So I doubt he's coming back. Kiermaier's the only one that I'd like to see back, but he had some. There was some comment of like he wants to play on grass, and we'll see. Maybe he's an option, but I don't think. Like I said, Varsho can cover center. They can really. I think the outfield is where they can add a big power bat this offseason. That's what they need to do.
Well, I do want to ask a question about the that press conference before we get too far along. So Ross Atkins and Aamir, you kind of touched on it. He and Dustin with the bus. Do you think that Ross Atkins is he's deflecting from himself, or is he trying to show that this manager does actually have autonomy and he's not just a bag man?
Yes, both, and I think he's. I don't know. I don't know. Obviously, what the deep culture is there, but I think that Aamir touched on it. Like, there's a culture of the analytics are, you know, uh, the number one decision making tool that they have, and everybody has to buy into that process. And they want to have this sort of appearance of being able to, um, allowing Schneider to make his own decisions. But, you know, he wouldn't have got the job if he didn't buy into that process, right? He
Well, he's
he
he's an
he's an org
organizational
guy,
guy, right? So
right? So I think it's both. I think he's trying to kind of say, listen, he's trying not to sort of neuter Schneider and say, he's like just a puppet, but he's also trying to say, I'm not the decision maker. I don't know. I think it's both.
Yeah, the problem is he's not fooling anyone. The fan base is like knows
Right.
what's up, and I think so. No matter if there was an effort to kind of put forth that, well, this is how it happens, even if it's what he's saying is 100% true, the fan base is kind of offside with him. Now, what will turn that around next season is if they start to win. But we'll see.
Yeah, winning solves a lot of problems.
Well, and Aamir, you weren't on last week, but uh, is they made the playoffs, so they were one of the top 6 teams in the American League. But this team essentially had one must-win game, which was Wednesday afternoon, and they failed miserably. This team didn't win like the last weekend when they could have secured their own passage. They couldn't do that either. They had to rely on a
Yeah.
Seattle loss, and so I do think big changes are necessary. And Ross Atkins seemed to be a bit, I don't know, borderline smug or like confident or smug that like, he's gonna, there's gonna be changes and players coming in. So I I'm a little skeptical saying that the Jays have thrown money around the last maybe 2 to 3 years. And so maybe they do have some answers lined up in the free agent market.
We'll see what
Oh,
happens.
definitely. Yeah, I gotta believe that they can sign at least one big boy um, in the off season. Uh, they've got the money for it. They're doing their renovations. They need the fan base to come back next year. They can't afford, to fail, and they know that winning puts butts in the seats. Um, so yeah, I think they're gonna if any year they're gonna go all in. You know, um, you mentioned Shohei Ohtani in the chat here, Aamir. I mean, if I doubt, like I highly doubt that they're gonna try and get him, but if there's any year that they fork out that kind of cash for somebody, uh, you know, I think this is a year that they're gonna do it. There's 2 more years left on um, Bo Bichette, I think, and Vladdy. This pitching staff is here for another year. Next year, the top 4 guys. Um, yeah, I mean, this is their window. The window's closing, and so when that happens, you gotta go all in.
I wanted to mention one more thing about the data discussion around the stats. And I wanted to I was thinking about things like before coming on here, and I expressed earlier like which stats are we valuing too much, and perhaps which stats are we valuing not enough. And what really boils down to is like basic core scientific concepts of reliability and validity when it comes to data. Reliability simply meaning like how consistent is a measure, right? And I think some of the stats we're looking at, there seems to be high levels of reliability. What we may lack in the statistical analysis, because we're looking at huge data sets as opposed to individual data sets related to a player's behavior, in relation to other variables, is the validity data. And are the stats actually giving us an accurate picture of what they purport to be giving us a picture of? Or is the use of the stats valid? Are we using them in a valid way? For example, just because we know this is a pictures of stats in a particular inning, for example, or any other stat, right? Does that actually mean, does that translate into a probability really and really, given all these other factors and circumstances? So there's that point. And the very last point is that all of these metrics are being analyzed not just by the Jays, but by all the other teams that they're playing in relation to one another. And all of these stats are being manipulated and utilized across different kinds of permutations, I guess, in terms of numbers when it comes to a decision making. So you don't really know. It's not really like one isolated stat that is a factor. Like Dustin mentioned earlier, the intangibles as well. It's all stats interacting with one another, and the output,
Yeah.
what you get on the field, that's probably why. Like I have this theory now that ever since they started using stats, and everyone got better at kind of manipulating and leveraging these numbers, it's like everything cancels everything out almost. It feels like. Feels is a very unscientific word, but that's what it feels like.
I think you're touching on kind of where the competition is now, right? Teams that can identify the stats that are valuable, that are repeatable, that are informative, and throw the ones that are just like noise or just are not predictive of any kind of real world, results. That's where the competition lies, for the on that decision making tree. And I think we see some teams a lot better at doing that than others. And sometimes though you can do that very well, and then there's a lot of luck. There's a lot of intangibles, not just intangibles from like these are human beings, but just a bad bounce.
Exactly. Chance.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's luck.
Matt Chapman's
Yeah.
two hits that are that one that went foul. If it's 2 inch, he hits it like a half a centimeter more forward on the bat, like if he's like that split femtosecond faster on his swing, that's a fair ball, and the game's different, right? So there's all that that goes into it. But yeah, every team's trying to find that edge, and the good teams are the ones that, like I said, and like you're implying, can sift through all this noise and find those stats that are meaningful and predictable.
Right. What is noise and what is not noise? Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me, Aamir and Dustin.
Thanks, Al.
Thanks for having me.